Welcome back, scholars. Hope you're well. This is a lecture recording for Chapter 6. We're going to talk about learning, the different forms of learning. So we'll talk about, and this will probably be broken into two parts. We'll talk about classical conditioning and operant conditioning in the first part. And then we'll also talk about several other forms of learning, observational learning, vicarious learning. So we'll talk about different ways in which we learn and how our behaviors, our human behaviors, are associated with the learning and our different types of learning, and so we'll move into some other things as far as cognition and intelligence in the coming chapters, and human memory, which also plays into learning because you have to have a memory of something in order to make an association. So a lot of the things that we'll talk about in the next several chapters are interconnected and lean and depend on one another to allow us to operate in an optimal and an efficient way. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started and get my laser pointer just in case I need it. And let's move this up. All right. So one of the first questions we ask, over the course of the last several decades, there have been theories or hypotheses about different learning styles, and each of us learns in various ways. And I want you to kind of think through this as you're going through and thinking about how you learn, how you best learn. Many people will be considered visual learners, and these are the individuals who need kind of charts and graphs and need to be able to see it visually. And it's not so much them listening, but if they can see something, then they can kind of retain it. The second is auditory learners. These are the individuals who don't necessarily have to write anything down, but they can hear something, and maybe it's a recording of something. And I do this oftentimes. I can listen to a video or listen to a podcast and pick up on some of the concepts and retain the information based on that. And so that's one of the ways in which I am better able to learn. And then you have reading and writing, which is another method I use to retain information, to get encode information into my memory system. So I read the information, I can read the textbook or read an article and then write notes down associated with it, and then review those notes to kind of retain information based on that. So I can read it, write it, and I have a pretty good memory, so I can go back and kind of connect the information together to synthesize it so that I get it into my memory bank. And then the last one is kinesthetic. And kinesthetic is I need to be able to put my hands on it. I need to be able to experiment with it. I need an activity. I need some type of assignment where I'm able to have it demonstrated to me so that I can see it, put my hands on it, and work through it. This graph is for our visual learners. They have to be able to see it visually. So diagrams, illustrations, pictures are always great. And so I like to intermingle those things together. So there's text, there's also images and illustrations and diagrams together with these other elements. Listening to lectures, recordings is more of auditory, oral. And then you have kinesthetic, like I said before, you need the experience, observation, activity, and need to be able to experiment with it to kind of see how things function, see things, how things operate. Some people can look at, one of our students talked about being a mechanic in the military, and they were able to just look at the diagrams, look at individuals do it. And so they were able to observe someone doing it, and then they were able to do it. So they're more kinesthetic and visual, being able to operate in those ways. And then others need to be able to read the material and then write up notes in order to do it. And so they write really detailed notes, and then they're able to read the information back and retain the information that way. And again, each person has a mixture of all four of these. I mean, you might have two of them, three of them, or all four, and you need to find the ones that are most effective for you to retain and learn the information that you're being presented in lectures and even at work at times. Okay, so here are our chapter objectives, but again, that wasn't necessarily the classical and operant condition that we were referring to, but those learning styles are really important. What we'll do tomorrow, there's a very, very short survey, and I want us to kind of walk through that survey together, and we'll see what our results are. And then we'll talk through ways in which we can better kind of move and ask our professors and our instructors to kind of tailor their lectures, perhaps, or provide information that can help us learn better. And so we have to be willing to, again, this is our experience in college, and so you want to make sure that you're getting everything you can out of your collegiate experience. Okay, so here are the objectives. It's a lot of them, but we'll talk about and highlight a few of them in more detail. So the bulk of this first part of this lecture is going to be on classical and operant conditioning. And classical conditioning was kind of discovered kind of accidentally. We'll talk about how that happened. But what is learning? That's the first key to this entire lecture is learning. Right? What is it? So learning is a lasting change in behavior due to experiences or an individual experience, and we learn almost every day. We learn something new every day. We have an association that we make, and conditioning is making and learning those associations between events. So what happens is we have a stimulus in our environment, and I like to use an example where, back in April 2011, 27th, 2011, we had a tornado here in Huntsville in the Madison County area. And the sirens that we hear when a storm is approaching or an inclement weather is approaching, that storm and those sirens created an association. So we associate the siren that we hear with inclement weather or the threat of inclement weather. And so that's an association that we've made. We also, for me, when the teacher rolled in when I was in elementary school with a cart with the TV on it, I made the association that we're going to be watching a video or a movie. And that was the association I made. And that's just learning due to experiences that we've made. Classical conditioning is learning which stimulus acquires the capacity to evoke a response that was originally evoked by another stimulus. So we'll talk about that. That was a little confusing, but one stimulus, we'll call it a neutral stimulus, which does not originally evoke a response, is then paired with and then kind of evokes a response that was originally evoked by another stimulus, and we'll talk about that and the process in which that happens. Okay, but one of the most classic ways to understand an association or classical conditioning is phobia, and you can think about the kind of phobias that you might have. Many of us may have a fear of heights or fear of spiders or fear of snakes, fear of tight or closed spaces, so claustrophobia. So all of these are phobias, and many of them, they're fears that we may have not even experienced. Maybe being bitten by a spider or even seeing a lot of spiders, but when we see them, we have an irrational fear, this intense fear. And so we'll talk about how that happens and how that occurs in our world. But a phobia is just an irrational fear of a specific object, situation, or activity. And oftentimes this fear can be extremely overwhelming. And people go to great lengths to avoid it at all costs. When I was, I think my first time ever going to Disney World, I was terrified of heights, and roller coasters were not something that I'd get on. And it took me a few times to go to the Disney World, right, Island of Adventure or Magic Kingdom, to overcome my fear of heights and be able to get on a roller coaster. I still don't do those rides that drop you. I hate like the Tower of Terror, or I don't know if anyone's ever been to Space and Rocket Center. They have a space shot. I hate those things that drop you instantly or kind of, I don't like those things. But I can go on things that take you, move you forward, right? Or move you backward, whatever. But if you can move horizontally, I'm good. But if you drop me vertically, I don't like those things. So I still have a mild fear of heights, but I can get on the roof, I can climb ladders and do things higher off the ground. But you know, mild phobias are really, really common, right? Like a mild fear of heights, maybe a mild fear of needles. Trip trypanophobia, excuse me, is the needles. Hemophobia, which is a fear of blood. Uh, People who are afraid of dogs and horses and reptiles. Again, all these individuals may have mild fears, and then others have very, very severe fears. And about 19 million people in America have one or more phobias that range from, very, very mild to extremely severe. Um, and the chances are that many of the phobias that we acquire through classical conditioning, where our original stimulus, say a dog, was not, it didn't evoke any emotion or any fear, any anxiety at all initially. But then maybe you had an experience when you were younger where a dog attacked you or bit you, and now you have associated the dog, which was originally a kind of a neutral stimulus, it didn't evoke any fear, to what we can now call a conditioned stimulus, where I can't really be around dogs because I have this fear that I'll be attacked again, right? And so that's kind of a classical conditioning example. Here are some common and other types of phobias, and there are some really, really weird ones, and there are some ones that are really more common to humans that many people have experienced or will continue to experience over the course of their life. Here's an interesting one. Uh, Pogonophobia, fear of beards. You know, I wear a beard now, but I can't imagine someone being fearful of beards, or you know, fear of being without a working phone. Nomophobia, right? Many of you are attached to your cell phones, and if your cell phone didn't work, that might be a fear of yours, right? You'd be disconnected from the world. Fear of ice or cold, fear of dogs, obviously, and they get fear of long words. And oddly enough, the longest of the phobias is a really, really long word. So that's really, really interesting. But here are these phobias, and you can kind of go through and see which ones are most odd to you. Okay. So let's go to and hint on classical conditioning in its more formal sense. So Ivan Pavlov, he was a German physiologist originally, and he was trying to identify what we call a psychic reflex. And the psychic reflex is when he was looking at the saliva in the digestive process in dogs. And so many of us already know when we are experiencing or seeing some of our favorite foods or smelling some of our favorite foods, we begin to salivate. And dogs are no different. Many organisms, many mammals have this salivation that they do when they're about to experience the kind of eating, and it prepares your digestive system to operate and function um, more optimally, more efficiently. And so what he did was Ivan Pavlov created this apparatus that you see. Right? He connected the dog in, locked the dog into this apparatus. He was able to almost always consistently accurately measure the amount of salivation or saliva that a dog produced, especially when paired with a meat powder. And so what he was doing was he'd show the dog the meat powder, the dog would then begin to salivate, and he would measure how much salivation the dog was producing or saliva the dog was producing. What began to happen was there was a neutral stimulus, and the neutral stimulus was the individual bringing the meat powder. And and so what happened each time the dog would hear the scientist approaching, his footsteps approaching, the dog would begin to salivate. And Dr. Pavlov was then able to see that even without pairing, without seeing the meat powder, even by again hearing the footsteps, the dog would begin to salivate. And even more so, even when if the dog just saw an individual with a white coat, they would salivate because they thought that there's association between those individuals with the white coats bringing the meat powder. And so a tone started out as a neutral stimulus in this experiment. So then he paired it with a tone, right? So every time they would bring in the meat powder, they would sound a tone, right? And then they would sound the tone, show the meat powder, show the tone, show the meat powder. They would pair the tone with the meat powder, and each subsequent tone and meat powder then the dog would then still elicit and evoke that same response. So Pavlov then paired that neutral stimulus with a stimulus that then produced the desired response. So this desired response was the salivation of the dog's mouth. So what he was able to demonstrate in this is that the stimulus response association formation is kind of the building block of what we do when we learn. There are associations that we make. One of the associations I make when it's really, really gloomy outside, I know that oftentimes when there's a lot, it's really, really cloudy and gloomy, that there's a higher likelihood or chance of rain. And so I will go get an umbrella or have my raincoat just in case it rains. And again, that's the association I've made because of past experiences. And originally, when I was younger, I didn't really make that association until I saw that the rain and the clouds were associated with rain and me needing a jacket or an umbrella. So here are, when we talk about Ivan Pavlov's demonstration there, here are the demonstration or the terminology and kind of the procedures that we'll follow. And I'll show you an example next of kind of how we will pair a stimulus or a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus or an unconditioned stimulus to then create that conditioned stimulus, right? So the number one thing that happens is you have these 5 different components. You have what we call a neutral stimulus. And in the example with the dog, the neutral stimulus was the tone, right? So what was happening, they would present the neutral stimulus and the neutral stimulus didn't evoke any response at all, right? The neutral stimulus was nothing. It didn't change any behavior whatsoever. And then you have what we call an unconditioned stimulus. And this is a stimulus that is a uh, natural response to, it's kind of a natural response to a stimulus, right? So the stimulus is the meat powder. The meat powder evokes a specific response because it's a natural response. And a lot of these responses, a lot of the stimulus of the stimuli are kind of um, those reinforcers, those primary reinforcers that kind of satisfy those basic needs. So food, water, shelter, all of those things are kind of primary, and they help to again evoke that what we call the unconditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response is kind of that unlearned reaction to the unconditioned stimulus, and it occurs without any conditioning whatsoever, right? So if you smell your favorite food or see your favorite food, maybe you go into a buffet, your mouth begins to salivate because, again, the unconditioned stimulus would be the food. The unconditioned response is your salivation and your excitement because you're about to eat. Okay, so then the neutral stimulus is then paired with the unconditioned stimulus. So for the demonstration for Pavlov and the dog, he sounded a tone and then he showed the food. He sounded the tone and then he showed the food. So again, he sounded the tone, showed the food, sounded the tone, showed the food. So now the neutral stimulus then becomes a conditioned stimulus. And so that neutral stimulus is then through conditioning evokes a conditioned response. And the conditioned response is that learned reaction to the conditioned stimulus, and it occurs because of the previous conditioning that we talked about. So, in order to make the neutral stimulus a conditioned stimulus, you have to go through several trials, right? And depending on the animal, the human, depends on how many trials, right? Some you may need 1 or 2 trials. Others you may need, 5 or 6 trials, or maybe 100 trials before you can link this neutral stimulus to the conditioned stimulus. But there are trials or any presentation of the stimulus or pair of stimuli to then evoke that unlearned uh, reaction. Okay, so here's just the sequence of events. So again, we talked about the neutral stimulus with that tone, right? Initially, before you have any conditioning, it evokes no response whatsoever. The meat powder is the unconditioned stimulus or US, and then the salivation is the unconditioned response. Right? This is before any conditioning happens whatsoever. Okay. So during the conditioning, these are the trials, right? You pair the tone with the meat powder. So each time you sound the tone, then you present the meat powder, you sound the tone, present the meat powder over and over and over again. The unconditioned response and the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned leads to the unconditional response, right? But all you're doing now is pairing your neutral stimulus to the unconditioned stimulus. All right. When you pair those two things over the course of time, then there becomes a conditioning. Right. So now when you hear the tone, you don't have to be presented with the bee powder, but then they salivate at the mouth. Right. So that neutral stimulus alone can then elicit that response. So now you have what we call a conditioned stimulus and a conditioned response. And what you'll understand is and realize is the unconditioned response is the same as the conditioned response, right? The only thing that changes is the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus is the once neutral stimulus that we use now to evoke the unconditioned and conditioned response. Okay? So here are three different ways that we see classical conditioning in everyday life. You can be conditioned to fear and have anxiety, and it helps to shape our emotional response. I use an example here of someone being afraid of bridges because their father used to scare them. But think of what used to happen back when um, in the civil rights era. There were individuals who were conditioned to think that Black people were scary or criminals or not so smart, right? So people were conditioned to have a fear of or an anxiety, just like now. Being a African American male, sometimes people are conditioned, right? White women are conditioned to see Black people as dangerous, and so we need to again change that. But again, that's a conditioned fear and anxiety. There's nothing inherently scary about any African American person, and everybody can be scary or have or evoke a fear response. But again, that is a conditioned fear and anxiety. And it's a learned thing. It's not something that occurs naturally. It's something that was conditioned that helps shape their emotional responses to African American people. Other conditioned responses can affect physiological processes, right? So if you've ever had food poisoning, like myself, I had, Subway one time and I got food poisoning. And I evoked the smell of the subway to it gave me a really, really upset stomach. So every time I would go in the subway subsequently after that food poisoning event, then I would get an upset stomach. And again, just that smell would give me a different immune response. So again, that is kind of a physiological response that occurs based on, um, a conditioned response. Evaluative conditioning is based on your acquisition of likes and dislikes through classical conditioning, and we are very very suggestible. When advertisers, business negotiators, recruiters, or politics, or politicians, they use different different associations to help elicit a particular emotional response from you, right? So if you have your favorite athlete, your favorite actress or actor, and they are serving as spokespersons for particular products, that evokes an emotional response, a positive emotional response, and that gives you more likelihood that you're going to buy the product, right? Just based on it's being associated with someone you like, right? And so that's the acquisition of your likes and dislikes. And again, your parents may not like a particular politician, or they may not like a particular restaurant, and just because they don't like it means you don't like it, and you pick that up because of classical conditioning, right? Again, you pair something, a positive or a negative emotional response, and you behave in a certain way because of it. Okay, so there are 7 basic processes in classical conditioning, and they're really, really important to how we think about um, the pairing of a neutral stimulus to an unconditioned stimulus and how it might be, uh, you know, recovered and extinct. So we'll talk through uh, some of these different processes. The first one is acquisition, and this is the initial stage of learning a new response. Uh, this is kind of the very first point, very first time you see, uh, the neutral stimulus paired with the, uh, the unconditioned stimulus. Those two things are being paired, and when you acquire that, that is the acquisition of it, right? Extinction is the gradual weakening and disappearance of a conditioned response. And so when I was, 13 and 14 years old, I got food poisoning, and Subway, I didn't like Subway for a long time. I couldn't really walk into it without getting an upset stomach. But after time had passed, there was a gradual weakening and even a disappearance of the conditioned response of me feeling really, really sick when I walked into a Subway just by smelling the restaurant. Okay. And then you have what we call a spontaneous recovery. And every so often, I walk into a Subway and it does make my stomach upset a little bit, just just for a small fraction of a second. And that reappearance of an extinguished response is called a spontaneous recovery. And this happens again after a period of non-exposure to the conditioned stimulus. But again, it does come back spontaneously when you haven't been around it, and then you come back, it spontaneously recovers every now and then. Okay. Another thing that happens with classical conditioning is what we call a renewal effect. And sometimes when that extinguished response will reappear if the subject is returned to its original environment where the first acquisition took place. All right, so if they go back to the original environment, oftentimes there is a renewal effect, and you can reteach even more quickly um, the the conditioning of the neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus. Okay, these two go hand in hand. You have what we call stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. So, stimulus generalization is a response to a specific new stimulus that are very, very similar to the original stimulus, right? So, if you have a dog that loves to go for walks, and you have his leash, and they know when you get the leash, they're about to go for a walk. If, for instance, you lose their leash and you have to buy a new one, um, the leashes are pretty similar, and so it's similar to the original stimulus. And so he's still going to be really, really excited when you get the new leash because it's very, very similar to the old one. Okay. A stimulus discrimination is when the individual, the organism does not respond to the new stimulus that are similar to the original stimulus. So say that the leash looks extremely different than their old leash, and so they don't really get excited because the new leash doesn't look anything like the new one. So again, that is what we call discrimination, right? They're able to discriminate between the two stimuli, and they don't react to the new one. And then the last one we'll talk about for classical conditioning is what we call higher order conditioning, and this occurs when you create a second conditioned stimulus, right? So let's take, for instance, the uh, Pavlov's demonstration with the salivation of the dog, and the dog and the salivation and collecting that data. So the original conditioned stimulus was the tone, okay? The tone when it was paired to the unconditioned stimulus, which was the meat powder. So now you sound the tone and the dog salivates, right? What you could also do is pair another conditioned stimulus to the tone, right? So instead of it just now being the tone, now you incorporate a light. So the light and the tone are two um, conditioned stimuli that work almost the same, right? So now the light can also evoke the same salivation of the dog. The second stimulus, however, is a little weaker. So it does not operate in the same way as the original conditioned stimulus, but it does and can work. It's just a little weaker and does not maintain the same strength as the original conditioned stimulus does. But you're able to add additional stimuli, one on top of the other, conditioned stimulus, one on top of the other. It is a possibility that you can do that. Okay. So here is an example that we'll go through, and I'll ask you a question. But what I want you when you're looking at this example, I want you to highlight each of the five different components of the classical conditioning process. So you've got a neutral stimulus, you have an unconditioned stimulus, you have an unconditioned response, you have a conditioned stimulus, and you have a conditioned response. And I want you to walk through in this experiment. I want you to walk through and identify each of those. I'll just highlight one when I ask you the question on the next slide, but I want you to be able to think through those so that you can answer any question when we're talking about any scenario based on classical conditioning. Okay, so this is considered concerning the Little Albert experiment, and the participant in this experiment was a child that psychologists John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner, and they're actually married, two psychologists they called Albert B, and who he's known popularly today as Little Albert. Okay, so when Little Albert was about 9 months old, Watson and Rayner exposed him to a series of stimuli, including a white rat, a rabbit, a monkey, masks, and burning newspapers, and observed Albert's reaction. Albert initially showed no fear of any of the objects he was shown. Okay? The next time Albert was exposed to the white rat, Watson made a loud gong noise by hitting a metal pipe with a hammer. Naturally, he began to cry after hearing the loud noise. After repeatedly pairing the white rat with a loud noise, Albert began to expect a frightening noise whenever he saw the rat. Soon, Albert began to cry simply after seeing the white rat. Okay, so looking at this example, what is the neutral stimulus? That's the first question, right? Then what is the unconditional stimulus? What is the unconditional response? What is the conditioned stimulus? And then what is the unconditional response? Okay, I want you to think through those three things or those five things and be able to answer them. Okay, here's one of the questions. Okay, so again, John B. Watson, Rosalie Rayner conducted what is known as the Little Albert study. So applying classical conditioning to this study, what was the unconditioned stimulus in this study, right? So if you think through the different processes of classical conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus is that natural stimulus that creates that unconditional response, right? So if you're thinking about it, the answer to this question would be B, right? So the unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that evokes an unconditioned response without previous conditioning whatsoever. So by striking the steel bar with the hammer, it startled little Albert, and that caused little Albert to cry, which is then the unconditioned response. So the unconditioned stimulus is the loud noise. The unconditioned response is him crying. The neutral stimulus in this example, so let's go back, would be the white rat. Right, the white rat initially had and evoked no fear response whatsoever. So if we go back here, again, initially showed no fear of any of the objects he was shown, right? So after he paired the loud noise to the white rat then became a conditioned stimulus. So every time now he sees the white rat, now he cries. Again, we have, evoked a response based on something that originally had no effect whatsoever. Okay. All right, so we'll stop right there. I'll pick up on on part two, excuse me, operant conditioning, and we'll finish out the chapter in part two of this lecture. Okay, we'll talk to you and see you again soon.